Snow covered everything. The trees looked like frozen statues, and the air was so silent that every sound seemed like a scream. It was exactly what I needed. Peace. After stressful months at work, I decided to spend Christmas at my grandmother's old cabin. I never understood why my family abandoned the place. They always told me that my grandmother disappeared there on Christmas Eve, and no one wanted to come back. But I didn't believe in ghost stories. The cabin was beautiful, surrounded by dense forest, perfect for disconnecting. The first night, I lit the fireplace, made hot chocolate, and lay down on the couch. Everything seemed perfect until I heard something. A song, low but clear. A children's song that I hadn't heard since I was little. I got up thinking it was my imagination. I looked out the window, but the snow was falling in absolute silence. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. However, the next day, the music returned, this time louder, coming from the forest. My curiosity overcame my fear. I grabbed a coat, boots, and a flashlight and followed the sound. The song was sweet, but it carried something disturbing. After walking for about 10 minutes, I found something in the snow. A small sled, old with torn ropes and dark stains. I went back to the cabin, scared. I tried to sleep, but the music wouldn't stop. Looking out the window, I saw something that chilled my blood. Snowmen lined up, looking directly at the cabin. I was sure they weren't there before. When morning came, I decided to go out and check. The dolls were different, made from old children's clothes. The song now seemed to come from them. At night, the music became unbearably loud. The lights in the cabin started to flicker, and I felt like something was watching me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one. I went to the window again and saw the snowmen moving. Slowly, one of them began to melt, revealing something horrible. A frozen human hand sticking out of the snow. The cabin door slammed violently, and the music stopped. In its place, I heard a soft, almost whispered voice. "Sing with us, or you'll never leave here." My grandmother's diary was on the table, open. She described the same music, the same ritual. Every decade, a soul must join the melody, or the forest would take more lives. It was an endless cycle. Now, I was chosen. The only way to escape would be to deliver someone else to the forest. I ran into the forest trying to get away, but the music seemed to chase me. The snowmen began to move, their black eyes glowing in the darkness. In the end, I had no choice. I entered the cabin and sang the song. When I finished, I felt something shatter inside me. The forest was silent again, but I knew I was part of it now. I decided to spend Christmas alone this year. After a fight with my mom about how I never show up for anything, I thought it would be best to avoid any further arguments. My new home seemed like the perfect place to retreat, an old townhouse on a quiet street, far from the chaos of the city. It was the first time I would have peace at Christmas. The night before, everything was calm. I decorated the tree with softly twinkling lights, put on some movie, and wrapped myself in a blanket with a glass of wine. For the first time, I felt that Christmas could be simple and peaceful, but as I looked at the tree, something bothered me. There was a gift there. I didn't put it there. The gift was wrapped in worn red paper with a faded gold bow. It had no label or sender. Maybe it's something I brought with me when I moved and forgot, I thought, trying to convince myself. I left the gift where it was and went to sleep, but the feeling of discomfort wouldn't leave me. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. My heart raced. I took my cell phone and slowly went downstairs. The room was as I left it, except for one detail. The gift was now in the center of the room, unwrapped. Inside the box was an old porcelain doll with glass eyes that seemed to follow me. Then I smelled it. A strong, burning smell like old wood being consumed by fire. I looked around, but there was no sign of fire. Just the doll, looking at me with that fragile smile. The next day, I looked for information about the house. I discovered that the previous owner, Margaret Wells, disappeared on Christmas Eve 1956. According to neighbors, she had complained about the sounds of footsteps and strange smells before she disappeared. I returned home terrified but determined to understand what was happening. I picked up the doll and examined it more closely. There was something engraved on the base. Forever home. Forever Christmas. That night the house felt colder. The lights on the tree began to flicker wildly. My reflection in the window looked different, like someone else was there with me. Then I saw the doll again, not where I had left it, but sitting on my bed, legs crossed like a playful child. That's when I realized the burning smell was coming from me, my hair, my clothes. I was in the same place Margaret disappeared, stuck in the same cycle. Now every time the clock strikes midnight on Christmas Eve, the events begin again. The gift appears under the tree. The doll watches me. The burning smell returns. And me? I don't know if I'm alive or dead. I just know that Christmas never ends. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places, but nothing could have prepared me for Tinseltown. The village was in a remote region of Montana, surrounded by dense forests and snow-capped mountains. It was said that, in the 1950s, it was known as the Christmas capital, famous for the toy factory that produced dolls, trains, and toy soldiers. But something went wrong. One night, during Christmas Eve, everyone in the village disappeared. Some people talked about a fire, others about something much worse. No one knew for sure, and the village was forgotten, covered in snow with its stories buried along with it. My friends and I, Sarah, Mike, and Ethan, decided that we would spend our Christmas exploring that place. We thought it would be fun until we entered the village. Tinseltown seemed frozen in time. Snow covered the streets, but we could see shop windows with old toys. A wooden sled stood in the middle of the main square, with melting snowmen surrounding it. When we entered the old factory, the air became heavier. There were toys scattered everywhere. Dolls with glass eyes, wooden horses creaking in the wind, and a row of toy soldiers lined up, as if they were waiting for something. Suddenly, a doll started playing Christmas music. The sound was sweet, but her eyes seemed to follow our movements. Mike laughed, saying it was just the wind, but there was no wind in there. Soon, sounds of children's laughter echoed through the factory corridors. They weren't happy laughs. They were distorted, almost tearful. "I don't like this," Sarah said, shaking. Climax, when we tried to leave the factory, we realized something was wrong. The toys had moved. The toy soldiers were now at the door, blocking our exit. The doll that had played the song was in the middle of the room, holding a small hammer in her hand. The toys began to move, first slowly, then faster. An old train left its track, heading directly towards Ethan, who fell screaming. Sarah tried to help, but a puppet fell from the ceiling, wrapping the strings around her arms. We ran to the back of the factory, where we found a room full of old documents. We discovered that the children who worked at the factory had mysteriously disappeared. The factory owners made a pact to save their business. They used dark magic to transfer children's souls into toys. The toys were now his jailers, imprisoned there forever, and now they wanted us to stay with them. Sarah and I managed to escape. I don't know how, but we crossed the forest until we found a road. Mike and Ethan were never seen again. Since that night, every Christmas, I hear the sounds of toys coming from empty spaces. I know they are still waiting for me, and that one day I will need to return to Tinseltown. I never thought I would go back to the village where I grew up, especially at Christmas. It had been years since my last visit. My grandmother always said that, on Christmas Eve, it was important to light a candle in the window. To guide the good spirits, she explained. But I knew the real reason. She was afraid of the visitor from the silent night. As a child, I laughed at this story. It was just a silly legend to scare children. A shadowy figure who appeared in forgotten Christmases, taking with him those who didn't respect the Christmas spirit. Now, as an adult, it seemed even more ridiculous. I arrived at my grandmother's house at dusk. Everything looked the same. The snow covering the roofs, the lights twinkling in the windows. But there was something strange in the air, something I couldn't explain. That night, after helping my grandmother prepare dinner, I decided to go for a walk. The cold bit my skin, but the tranquility of the village reminded me of childhood. It was then that I saw the footprints in the snow. They were big, much bigger than a human's. They started in the middle of the street and ended in front of my grandmother's house. The strangest thing was that there were no turning marks, just a trail heading towards our door. When I went back inside, I mentioned the footprints to my grandmother. She turned pale. "Did you light the candle?" he asked, his voice shaking. "No, Grandma. I don't believe in those things," I replied. Her look was one of pure terror. Shortly after, I started to hear sounds coming from outside. Distant bells, but different from Christmas bells. They had a serious, almost threatening tone. Then, footsteps echoed on the roof. In the living room, my grandmother opened an old trunk and took out a dusty book. It was a diary that belonged to my great-grandmother. The pages talked about the visitor, a tall hooded figure with a bag on his back. It was said that inside the bag he carried not gifts, but the souls of his victims. Suddenly the lights flickered, a metallic sound echoed through the chimney. I looked up and saw something slowly descending. It was a tall, thin figure with a red cloak stained with something dark. His face was hidden, but his eyes glowed like embers. I tried to run, but my legs were paralyzed. He walked over, taking something out of the bag, a gift box. When I opened it, I saw my own face inside it, as if I were trapped there, screaming. I don't know how I managed to escape. When I woke up, it was morning. The village seemed normal, but something was wrong. My grandmother was nowhere to be found, and the front door was open, with snow pouring in through the entryway. Since that day, I never returned to the village. But every Christmas Eve, I hear those distant bells, and I know that one day he will come back.